Are you ready to go? Yeah. Hi everyone. We are privileged to have you today in person and also online, joining us for the third mediation talk for the winter term. And today we are privileged to have John Kausch taking us through what he calls a phonosemantic writing system. It's such an interesting talk. Before we invite our speaker today, may we have Sina to give us the land addressment. Sina.
We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chonokton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dishwood-Wonsu Covenant. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nations, Metis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors.
Thanks, Sina. So who is Jack, our presenter for today? Jack Kausch is a library and information science PhD student. He received his MA Honors in linguistics from the University of Edinburgh and an MSc in information science from City University, London. In his previous research, he specialized in formal semantics and the creation of ontologies. His project is on testing user interaction with interfaces and visualization of knowledge graph data for the semantic web. He's also interested in the history of writing systems and Renaissance ideas of universal language, which have provided aesthetic inspiration for his design work. In his spare time, Jack really loves to travel a lot. I'm wondering where he'll be traveling to after today's talk. So with a round of applause, may we welcome Jack Kausch to give us a talk on a semantic writing system. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Ebenezer. I am going to be talking today about creating a new writing system with emojis. And this is defined as a phonosemantic writing system. I'm going to be explaining a little bit more about what that means. This is a highly interdisciplinary topic that combines linguistics, information science, and semiotics. There we go. All right. So I understand that most of us will not know what Panlex or Swadesh means in this context. So first, I'm just going to define some of the terms I'm going to be using in this talk. And then I'm going to proceed to a historical critique of the creation of universal languages. There'll be some theory and some historical background. And then I'm going to talk about research creation, because I view the creation of writing systems as an act of research creation. First, just a little bit more about how I got here. In my undergraduate in linguistics, I focused on semantics, which is about what words mean and how you can represent that with logic. And this led me very naturally into information science, where you can build taxonomies and ontologies that allow you to create representations of what meaning is. And I became more and more interested in data visualization. And this has led me further and further down an artistic path, a designer's path, looking at how people interact with visualizations of the data that you find inside languages. So I'm going to start by defining some terms. What does phonosemantics mean? I know that's a word that most of us will not be familiar with. It comes from the Greek phono, sound, and semantics, meaning, and it's the idea that words have the meanings inside of how they sound. So you have this in onomatopoeia a lot, words like bang and snap. what they mean is what they sound like. Now, in most of linguistics, this is not a theoretical framework that you apply to other words, but I am making the argument that in order to understand some of the ideographic writing systems I'm going to be talking about in this talk, you need to take a phonosemantic framework. For Chinese writing, there's even a category of glyphs called xinsheng, which translates almost perfectly to a phonosemantic glyph. So the idea that there's a link between what a word means and what it sounds like is very important for understanding these writing systems. Now, when I talk about Panlex, I'm talking about a database and a nonprofit organization, which was aiming to translate every word in every language. And they got 4,000 out of the world's 6,000 languages. And so it's a giant translation dictionary, a huge lexicon. And I'm going to talk more about Panlex in a bit. And then when I talk about what a Swadesh list is a list of universal concepts that linguists make of ideas that are supposedly common across all of the world's languages. And usually they look at thousands of different languages, and then they create a list such as this. And so I'm considering Swadesh lists as, can we make this into a tool for information organization? And some of the questions I'm asking are, is this ethical? Is this good? And so my two big questions from information science and semiotics are, how can we choose good categories? And that's the first question. And then the second one is, how do we represent those categories? That's from semiotics. So here in types of writing, I want to make a distinction between two kinds of writing: alphabetic writing, like what we see on this slide, and ideographic writing that uses pictures and sounds to make associations between meanings. So there's more to writing than this, but that's a distinction that I'm going to be making right now. And writing systems like Chinese, Egyptian, Sumerian, and Mayan are examples of ideographic writing systems. So I've made this distinction. I know I'm throwing a lot of terms all over the place. And then the final thing I want to talk about is the Characteristica universalis. This is an idea that came from Leibniz's dissertation in 1666. It was an idea of an alphabet of images that you could combine with logic that could translate all the languages of the world, be radically interdisciplinary, and translate knowledge across academic disciplines, and be an instrument of discovery and invention in its own right. And if you want to learn more about the history of this, Umberto Eco wrote a monograph called The Search for the Perfect Language, which approaches all of this from the perspective of semiotics. And so this idea that Leibniz came up with is one of the guiding stars that I have for all of the interfaces I've been creating. A lot of what I've made has been attempts to implement things from his dissertation from 1666 and bring them to light online. But there may, in fact, be some problems. There's a long backstory to this. The Characteristica universalis is usually just spoken of as just something that comes out of nowhere, like Leibniz just had this idea out of nowhere. But there's actually a backstory that goes back about 2,000 years before Leibniz. And I'm going to be discussing that right now in a little bit of a historically grounded critique. And the question I'm asking is it even possible to create a universal languages of ideas? Is this even a worthwhile pursuit? So the first, I want to correct a common misconception that exists in alphabetic cultures, particularly in Western cultures, which is that ideographic writing represents ideas with pictures. In reality, ideographic writing also makes use of sounds. So there's this idea about Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese characters that they're picture writing, and you read them and you just almost magically come to understand what they're saying. But in reality, there's also an element that's dependent on the way people speak and dependent on language. So there's something in linguistics which we call the rebus principle, which is the way in which ideographic writing represents words. It uses visual puns. So if I wanted to represent an abstract concept in English like belief, it's very hard for me to draw an icon of belief. So what I do is I use a rebus. I draw a picture of a bee and I draw a picture of a leaf, and you read it as a pun, bee, leaf. You put it together and you can see what I'm talking about. So this is how all of these writing systems historically become capable of expressing language, is by using a mechanism like this. And the issue with this is that you have to know and speak the language. You have to be a cultural insider to actually be able to understand many of these references. And this is one of the things that makes it so hard to learn one of these writing systems, because it requires you to learn a great deal of material and to really understand the culture. But in late antiquity, about 2,000 years ago, the Greeks encountered the ancient Near East. They encountered Babylon, Egypt, and Persia. And I'm borrowing this idea from John Walbridge called Platonic Orientalism to explain the kind of misapprehension that has occurred when particularly Greek-speaking peoples encountered Egyptian writing. So there was this idea that the Greek philosophers originally studied in in Egypt, Babylon, and Persia, and took some kind of mystic wisdom of the East back to Greece with them. And after the time of Alexander's conquest, when the Greeks were standing in a colonial relationship to these countries, this was sort of accelerated and became these very sort of popular movements that viewed these cultures as having some kind of arcane esoteric secrets. And this applied to Egyptian writing as well. So Greek writers perceived Egyptian writing through the lens of Platonism and assumed that hieroglyphs were these sort of like divine images that you could just interpret magically just by looking at them. And they thought this was non-discursive writing. And it's occurring in the context of a colonized country where the Greek language is held in higher social esteem than the Egyptian language. So most of the people who are at the Library of Alexandria would never go and learn Egyptian anyways. So it has so there's this mystique, but no one's actually bothering to learn the language. So no one knows how the writing system actually functions. I'm going to focus on a specific text for a second because this text is just fascinating. So there was a book written by an Egyptian priest called Horapollo called the Hieroglyphica, and he taught at the Serapeum of Alexandria. And he wrote an encyclopedia describing the meanings of the hieroglyphs. And the most mysterious thing about it is he gives some of their real meanings, but he doesn't describe them with any linguistic explanation. He describes them as though they're allegories. He describes, the heron means this because she takes good care of her young. And so he writes almost like a bestiary. And he wrote in Coptic, but Mark Wildish at the University of Hong Kong argued that a student of his named Philip translated this manuscript into Greek and then added in a second manuscript where he just made up a bunch of hieroglyphs. So you have a really bizarre text where you have some genuine Egyptian hieroglyphs, allegories, and then a bunch of made up hieroglyphs, and you can't really tell which is true and which is fake, and you're in this very bizarre semiotic territory the entire time. And then the story gets crazier because 1,000 years after it was written around the year 400, it was discovered on the island of Naxos by a Florentine explorer who brought it to Florence, and it had a massive influence on the European Renaissance. All of these artists were reading this book and using it, and many artists who you'll probably have heard of. But they also, important for our story, is they also inherited this Platonic Orientalist idea of non-discursive writing, and they extended this idea to Chinese characters at that time, because Europe was just starting to encounter Chinese literature. So they extend, and so they start thinking of all writing systems in this way. And so this is one of the main vectors for how this misconception about writing came about. So this is a small work of research creation I did, sort of subverting this history. And which I had a lot of fun doing this, because my favorite entry from Horapollo is the one about how they signify a horoscopus, which is not a horoscope, it's someone who's a timekeeper. That's what that word actually meant for them, was someone who kept track of what time it was. So they said it's a man eating the hours. And this is a completely abstract, weird, Baroque thing in Horapollo. A lot of his entries are like this, like, not that the man eats the hours, that is impossible, but because food is prepared for man according to the hours. Okay. Like, what does that mean? But someone in the Renaissance decides to depict it as a man eating an hourglass. And hourglasses never existed in antiquity. So it's this bizarre, semiotic reinvention of what this symbol is supposed to mean. But what I love about this Renaissance depiction from the 16th century is it looks very similar to an actual Egyptian glyph, which has 5 different meanings depending on context. It can be transcribed as the word wanum, to eat, zawar, to drink, sadah, to think or to recount, Gara, to be silent, or Murish, to love. So it has all these different meanings. And so I thought it would be really fun to sort of complete the circle to create a piece, potentially for a font, where I took the Egyptian glyph and photoshopped the emoji of a hieroglyph back in there to sort of complete the circle and complete the historical conversation. So this is just a small aside about some of the ways in which I've been using creating fonts to sort of play with this semiotic history. Okay, and then how this becomes ideas of universal language. There's a text from the Renaissance called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, a novel called The Love and Sleep of Brother Polyphilo, written by a very eccentric Venetian monk. And in this book, he creates new forms of hieroglyphs because they had this idea they're just allegorical. You can just make up some new ones. So they started making these allegorical hieroglyphs, but you can't understand them unless you read the inscription underneath. They're completely impossible to interpret. But also this does influence the history of art. Like I was saying, one of the illustrations is here an image of an elephant with an obelisk on its back, which is a bizarre, weird reinvention of Egyptian history. Bernini actually made a statue of this for, I think, Pope Urban IV. So it exists in Rome. So this Orientalism is productive. It's manufacturing fake histories that are turning into real art objects in the Western world. So there's this bizarre kind of almost semiotic mania that starts to happen. Okay, and then the scientific revolution occurs. And what happens in the scientific revolution is people stop believing that icons, that you can have a Platonist reading of things, that this can refer to pure ideas. But this transformed into, let's create an alphabet of human thought that would be completely unambiguous. And John Wilkins at the Royal Society tried to make one of these in his real character language, where he creates a set of pictograms that are supposed to represent just pure ideas. And this is the idea that came, this is what influenced Leibniz. So this is the backstory. So ultimately, all of this is rooted in an ancient Orientalist misapprehension of what's actually going on in these writing systems and how they function. Even John Wilkins, and this goes on. I mean, in Echo's monograph, he traces like hundreds, almost thousands of people who've tried to do this. But that we don't have time in this talk to go over the whole history. That was just a really brief sketch of the story. And now I'm going to talk about the research creation aspects of things. So why am I talking about phonosemantics as a means to create a writing system like this? So I decided I would use emojis because we all know them, but I'm not a big fan of emojis. Emojis are culturally conditioned. The Unicode consortium that standardizes emojis is controlled by tech companies on either side of the Pacific. So you have a very small group of people who are actually contributing their cultural input into what should be the common picture language. And there's no image that's semiotically neutral. But I settled on emoji because you could represent them across devices, which just speaks to the amount of control that the Unicode consortium has. But when I'm talking about creating a phonosemantic writing system, I want to subvert this idea of a universal language as just being, we have a set of icons that will be completely unambiguous to people by trying to find a mechanism to create a rebus principle that could add sounds back in. So then you actually have sounds associated with your images, and you have sounds associated with your universal categories, and you can have more forms of linguistic play. So I found a way to map emojis to the International Phonetic Alphabet. And here's a text version there, which you can pass around. And this is an English text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right there, transcribed into emoji. And I first translated them into the IPA, and then I translated the IPA into emoji, and that's what you can see on the document. And now I'm going to tell you how I did it. The first step was I had to select what are the universal concepts I'm going to represent with emoji. And so I decided to use the Panlex database and use one of their Swadesh lists, because these would be highly translatable into 2,000 different languages. So the goal of the Panlex project is radically inclusive translation. You could interpret this in many different ways. They also are taking resources from all over the world that are sometimes 100 years old, that may have been collected in problematic ways, and trying to collect basically all of the minority and underserved languages. Now, another thing about these Swadesh lists I chose, that you could also say this is Western-centric, is they were based on a group of Russian researchers whose names I really should have put on the slide. But they created this first standardized Swadesh list based on a Latin language. So they standardized into Latin because they thought, we don't want to choose a language that has cultural connotations where one nation will say they're the ones who have it. So of course they chose Latin, which has huge cultural connotations and keeps us, bound to, Rome for some reason. So that adds in another level of, it's highly Western-centric. Latin is the Western language. And then the purpose of these Swadesh lists were not to actually communicate universal concepts to people. The Long Now Foundation funded this in order to create Rosetta disks, tiny micro-etched disks of all the world's languages that are supposed to last for 40,000 years. And they sort of scatter them around the planet, and they sent some of them into space, and they put one of them on the moon. And so they're like doing all with the Israeli Space Agency. So that's the purpose of this. It's sort of like a billionaire's plaything. So it's not necessarily the best, the best data to use, but it was the broadest data of its kind. If you wanted to say, where we want to represent all the languages of the world. This was the data set I knew about that I thought would do the best at that for all of the perhaps problematic things that might mean, and we can talk about that. So the first thing I did was I went into Emojipedia and I took each concept and I translated it into English and I searched for it in Emojipedia. And if it wasn't in Emojipedia, I selected an Egyptian hieroglyph to represent that concept. And then I arranged the lists into a taxonomy. The original Swadesh list had oppositions. It had, for every term, there was an opposite term. And this worked very well with my design because I didn't quite go in depth into Leibniz's De Arte Combinatoria frontispiece, but for every term there was an opposite term. So I copied this idea and I put fire opposite water, which you can see, and sun opposite moon. So antonyms will be on opposite sides of the circle. And then there are also daughter nodes. So the daughter of fire is sun and day, and the sister nodes are supposed to be complements. The sister glyphs are supposed to be related to each other. And then in this interface, you could click on each glyph, and it would take you to a table in a wiki that I built that would have the name of the language and all the different words in that language to write that concept. So the idea was you could click through this interface and instantly see a long list of translations in all these languages. Is it adequate? Is it, yeah, I don't. But here, this was a first attempt at doing that. And then I said, okay, I want to map these glyphs, these sounds, these meanings you can see over there to characters in the International Phonetic Alphabet. How can I do that? So the first thing I did was I looked at the data and I said, well, since I have all of this linguistic data, can I look at all of the different characters used to write those concepts across languages? And what I discovered is across all languages, the most common characters were the letters A and U, which didn't tell me much, except for the universal concept for nose that was written with the letter N. And I thought this was a very, very exciting result, but it wasn't, I couldn't really use this because it was the data's too idiosyncratic. And another huge problem with this, and the reason why I didn't use this, was because it's highly Western skewed, this data. All we see here is the Roman alphabet. And if you have things from the Tamil alphabet or the Thai alphabet, they'll be way down and you'll have like one occurrence. But those sounds should also be able to make a contribution because they also, these writing systems also represent different sounds. So you only see things from Western alphabets represented up at the top. And even when you see Western alphabets, I have no way of knowing if in a given language the character A is being used to represent the sound ah or ah. I have no way of knowing. It'll vary language by language, and some of the languages were transcribed in IPA and others of them weren't. So I decided to discard this. I decided this is way too skewed, way too Western centric. So instead, I took someone else's work, Agrawal's psychological model of phonosemantics, which I loved when I discovered it because he created a taxonomy that was very similar to my taxonomy in design. And I used it as an inspiration to make a mapping of letters in the IPA onto the emoji in my taxonomy. And then you could take any language, create it, and the IPA is a phonological alphabet designed by linguists to create an exact phonetic transcription of a language. So it transcribes exactly the way someone speaks, not because every writing system has some inconsistencies. So this is an exact transcription of how someone speaks. And so you create a phonological transcription of a text, and then you can translate it into this IPA emoji sort of thing. And maybe not the most accessible because we're asking everyone to learn the IPA and emoji at the same time. But that was a demonstration that this is what it would kind of look like. And then the other idea is that each one of these characters would represent a sound, but would also have meanings in 2,000 different languages associated with it. Okay. So future interfaces, I thought I am designing a new font right now, I should say, so I'm not going to be dependent on emojis and Egyptian hieroglyphs anymore. But again, as a sole creator in my own cultural context, creating semiotically universal images is a problematic task. So that's still something that I have not come to a conclusion on, and I would love to hear anyone's thoughts about that. But I thought about eliminating vowels for the next mapping and instead use vowels to represent Boolean operators so that you could put together consonants that would represent concepts and have only 3 to 5 vowels and have them represent Boolean operators. And what is above, you see that's a diagram of how vowels relate in either the vowel triangle or the vowel trapezium in the human vocal tract. So this is based on the 5 most common vowels that you find across all languages. could represent 5 logical operators so that when you put together a word, it would be like you're writing search terms when you're writing, X or Y. And so then a word like fog would have an exact meaning, and you could type that in with the glyphs and use it to refine a search for information retrieval. That's one potential application that I'm thinking about. So then it'll refine the documents cross-linguistically. And why this matters, I view my work as aligned with the mission of the Wikidata and Wikifunctions branch of the Wikimedia Foundation, headed by Denny Vrandicic, who is trying to create an open knowledge graph that anyone can edit in all of the languages of the world. And I'm hoping to be able to use this interface to allow people to explore this information that is being created cross-linguistically and make connections across languages as a new kind of exploratory information retrieval tool, one where you're not bound in by what you can already think of, but one that facilitates experiences of browsing. And this is just a little bit of tech stuff. There's this new technology called Neuro-symbolic computation. Really, people have been working on it for 20 years. It's about using logic to make AI more ethical. That's what it is. And I've been working on some data visualizations with Zhenwei Tong at the University of Toronto, where we've been looking at some of the really cool technology he's invented, which allows you to show the extent to which certain entities are a member of a class. And this could be visualized in a lovely way, and is going with some of our work at the Insight Lab, which is about using ontologies to refine information retrieval of electronic health records. So that's the tech stuff. That's sort of where it lives. But that's just sort of that's where some of this could be going. And then the summing up. So I think people need ways to interact with information that simplifies the complexity. And a mnemonic, mapping sounds to meanings, helps people to memorize some of these categories. My challenges are also my research questions. How do you make category distinctions that are non-problematic? Can you? The answer might be no. How do you make images which are interpretable across all cultures? Can you? The answer might also be no. How do you make mappings to sounds which are based on real phonology? That's the question from linguistics. So these 2 questions, both information science and media studies, the first 2, have a lot to say and a lot to comment on. And finally, that's where this is going. Hopefully, I don't know, that's where this conversation is happening, the Journal of Universal Language, because I think it has some things to comment on there. And that is it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, John. That was great. Now is our question and answer period, and I'll start the ball rolling. As you know very well, better than I would, like in the West, we've had certain ideas or notions of there being a lingua franca. So you go back 2,000 years, Greek, then followed by Latin, and then in the 19th century, French, and today English, which is easy for us, born in Canada, or Irish again. So I'm curious, and then as you know, like there's artificial discursive attempts like Esperanto. So I was wondering if you could speak to what are the advantages of a non-discursive lingua franca?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't see this as being similar to Esperanto in the simple point. I mean, often these kinds of projects are lumped in with Esperanto because you're trying to create a new language, and there's a kind of idea that it should be sort of universal, or so there's a kind of universality idea about it, whether that's possible or not. But with Esperanto, you're creating a new lexicon and new words that people are going to speak. And this, even though there's a possibility for people to build new words out of the characters, it's really a new writing system with sounds attached to it. So you could use this to create a new language, but it's a bit different from like Esperanto or Lojban, where I've created a dictionary of words and I'm saying, okay, now learn these words and talk to each other. I've just created symbols that you can then combine to create your own associations between things. So I view it more as creating a writing system than creating a whole new language that we're going to speak. Although it could lead to that. And one of the things I thought of is the process of creolization, where when you look at the ways in which a pidgin language becomes a Creole, pidgin languages are born in times of cultural contact. Creoles happen with the next generation of speakers who add grammar to it. So I don't think grammar is something that you can design. I think it's something that particularly children dream up as they're learning a language. And you can see this happens with pidgins. The children transform it into Creole. So that would be my answer. I'm not trying to present a new grammar. I'm just creating a writing system.
Yeah, it seems on one hand a little more modest than creating a language people can speak. On the other hand, it's so much more ambitious because it seems you're incorporating hundreds of thousands of.
Yeah, it is. It is once more modest and also in a way more ambitious because you do want to actually make sure that you try to understand the entirety of the human experience. And I'm really trying very hard to correct my biases or to eliminate my biases to the extent that that's possible. That may not be possible in order to do this.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Does anyone in person have any questions? Sarah?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was thinking more about this as a research creation project, and because this is a bit of a provocation or subvert a system and offer a critique, I wonder how you might deploy this in a manner to really activate that for someone who might engage with this. So how do you envision people engaging with this? Digitally, is it somehow in person, and how might you be able to convey some of that critique you're offering through that engagement with the audience?
Well,
maybe you're not quite there yet with your thoughts.
Well, no, that's a really, really great question. I mean, the purpose of this right now is really for it to be used digitally, and for people to actually be interacting with information online. But I've always maintained that I want it to be capable of being written as well. In terms of the critique that I was offering, I view the act of creation as being kind of a critique itself, because the ways in which this cultural story that I've told has been sort of consistently misrepresented has led to a situation in which there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about what these writing systems can be. And even though I'm not proficient in any of these writing systems, I know that, like, you know, if you look at, like, people always say, like, the problem with translating Lao Tzu from ancient Chinese is that you can't, like, there are depths in the text that you just cannot render with this kind of writing system. So to me, the subversion is actually like revealing this older mode of writing that we have somehow neglected and actually bringing that back in some sort of way by combining these two things. Does that make sense?
Jack, I was wondering, you mentioned earlier Umberto Eco's search for the perfect language. And I was wondering if somebody was interested in pursuing this topic further, and if you could point to one text, okay, here's sort of a foundational text to help you know where the subject is or where I am, what this is all about. Would that be the text, or can you recommend something else perhaps?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a really, like, big picture historical overview, that is the text. If you're looking for understanding, you know, the significance of Leibniz's Characteristica Universalis specifically, but if you're looking to understand, I mean, you could also read Francis Yates' work, The Art of Memory, which does a really good idea of tracing some of the other historical background to this. That's a great book that you could read. But then if you're interested in Poor Apollo, for instance, there's a great book by Eric Iverson. Most of these books are actually kind of old, but Eric Iverson, even though he influenced later Egyptologists, is still great. He wrote a book called The Myth of Egypt and its Hieroglyphs in European Tradition, which is also a great monograph. Really interesting. So those are three texts that are really, really helpful for getting the historical stuff right. But if you want to understand more of the philosophy and the mathematics, I think, like, you know, reading Leibniz directly can help.
That's
like,
intimidating.
that's if you don't want to do that, I would recommend just reading the historical stuff. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. An interesting collection of authors. Thank you, Jack. Matt, do we have anyone online?
We do. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Thanks. Sorry if I just like missed something, but you said that you mapped the IPA to the emoji. Does that mean that you can read your opening to the Universal Declaration?
Yeah, you can
What does
read.
it sound like?
I mean, I'm not proficient in my own mapping yet, but I can, you know, I can read it. So maybe that's not a great, you know, but yes, yeah, you can. I have a text here that's sort of a Rosetta text, and when I look at them side by side with the IPA transcription, yeah, I can sound it out. Yeah.
Okay. And my second question was, if you're looking for like a writing system that perfectly like already represents like an abstract of the sounds that we make, why not just use Hangul already?
Why not
Because-
just use Hangul? Yeah.
Yeah, because the consonants already represent the shape, the mouth shapes that you need to make them.
That is very cool and a very good point. I don't want to just take any one culture's writing system and like put it over another, even though, as we talked about, emojis are already kind of implicitly doing that. And then another thing about the mouth shape that the consonants make is that I actually do want there to be a kind of semantic element to the writing system as well. I want it to have kind of an ideographic element as well, so that you can write in both at the same time. Because I think that's where, I mean, this is just plain personal preference, but I just think that's where the really fun linguistic games begin, where you can make sort of interesting interplays between sound and meaning based on which glyphs you choose. So it's like a whole different kind of writing. And Hangul, as I understand it, not being able to read Hangul, is just a syllabary. Is that right?
It's an alphabet that's arranged in syllabic blocks.
Okay. Okay. That's very interesting. Yeah, that I would love to talk to you more about that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so basically like how you can kind of do more kinds of puns like you can in Chinese.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, based on the meaning and sound interplay. Yeah, okay.
That's what I'm looking for. I mean, Hangul is an amazing writing system, but I felt like I wanted to go beyond just I mean, maybe a syllabary is the wrong word, but beyond just a syllabic approach. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Mackenzie, you have a question? Thank you.
Yeah, Zach, not to torture you or anything, but given the inherent cultural biases of emojis, why not develop your own, system of symbols? Like, why not develop like from scratch?
Yeah, I am doing that right now for Sarah's research creation class. I'm working on some work that's going to be attached to this, but I'm still, conscious of the fact that I'm an agent producing this, and that I will have my own cultural, tastes and things that will be coming through here, and just my own biases. The other thing about that is, again, it goes back to the power of the Unicode consortium. I mean, they just have so much power that I would create a font, but then anyone, if I wanted to run this, if I wanted to build a website, I could work on a website, but you'd have to have people installing this font. Whereas the lovely thing about Unicode characters is suddenly they're on all devices simultaneously. So it's one of these institutions that you don't really think about a lot, but they actually control all of the emoji in the world and all the text, all the script that we see online. Actually, they're very but submitting new character proposals to the Unicode consortium takes a long time. It's a very lengthy process. So maybe if I can come up with a use case, that would be the ideal.
One word I saw come up a few times in the slides is the word orientalism. I was wondering if you could comment on that aspect of the history of scholarship here.
Yeah, so I actually got this from reading Hanne Graf's Esotericism in the Academy, who was a scholar from Amsterdam, but he was taking it from the source that I cited in the slides from 20 years previously. It's tough to talk about this as the same kind of Orientalism that we have in our present day, because it's just a very different cultural context. Christianity and Islam do not exist as world religions, and there's just a very different economic relationship between these countries. So there have been some people who said, you really shouldn't use that term to describe what was happening 2,000 years ago. It might be superficially similar, but there's something different going on. But nevertheless, the Greeks had this idea about barbarian, so-called barbarian cultures.
The non-Greek.
The non-Greeks, yeah, that's what it meant to them. And they have all these sort of exoticizations, and if you read their literature, people are depicted as just these, monstrous and also beautiful and exotic, all the sorts of things that we associate with that kind of mentality. And also, they were in a colonialist relationship to these cultures after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And one way that I have interpreted For Apollo's Hieroglyphica is as a representative from a colonized culture trying to find a way to preserve what's left of their culture while at the same time sort of subverting the colonizer. And so that's why, because this priest presumably clearly did know how to write hieroglyphs, but he's writing for a Greek-speaking audience in a Greek city, in a city that is a colonialist project that was never owned by the Egyptians, that was built solely to extract wealth. So he's writing to sort of subvert. So there are commonalities, even though definitely we have to admit that the cultural and historical context is very, very different. There are also commonalities. And so I view Horopalo's hieroglyphic as almost being like an effort of a colonized culture to preserve itself, in essence, even though it's a very different kind of colonialism than we know today.
Years ago, I went canoeing up in Teddyco, a provincial park near Thunder Bay, and I saw some cave drawings. So like there were some, I don't know,
Yeah.
you know, I need to be careful, I don't know how old they were, but so it's kind of fascinating. I'm intrigued by the idea. Like I could make some inferences about what they were about. They may have been half wrong, I don't know, but they showed certain animals. So I'm intrigued by the idea of non-discursive writing and the idea that I, speaking a different language, decades, centuries later, can infer possible meanings from those etchings and drawings. So it's kind of very interesting.
Yeah, well, I do think the Anishinaabeg people who come from this area have the Wigwassabah. And I think in many Algonquin peoples, there's been a real attempt to kind of alter the narrative and claim that the hieroglyphs that they had were not writing. But there have been a series of like books written on birch bark scrolls that do record a lot of knowledge. Some of them, I think Mi'kmaq hieroglyphs have like maybe have a rebus principle going on. The Wigwassabah, I think you have to be a member of certain societies to know the stories to be able to read them. So they're different. It's not a hard and fast thing between the moment that a system of symbols has the rebus principle and it doesn't. There can be sort of zones of difference, but there are also writing systems that don't use sound at all. Linguists call them proto-writing. Whether that's an accurate thing is not, but yeah, there are hieroglyphs from here too. Yeah.
I like the idea of proto-writing. So about the transform. Okay, well, does anyone online have? Okay, thank you.
Andy, if you want to unmute yourself.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to. Anyways, I had a question, but I guess it's kind of two parts because I want to make sure. So with the first part, I want to make sure I'm exactly clear, right, about like what the smallest unit of this language is directly corresponding to, this phonosemantic language, which, if my understanding was correct, kind of roughly corresponds to like there's a relationship between the form and function that's very direct. Would that be fair to say?
Not sure I know what you mean, Andy. What do you
mean?
Sorry.
So what does the smallest unit of this proposed language correspond to?
So there are two layers. One is it corresponds to a lexeme or a word that's translatable across multiple different languages, or supposedly it's supposed to be a concept above the language of a word.
Right.
And then it also corresponds to a phoneme or a sound that can be made, either a vowel, a semi-vowel, or a consonant. That's what the system I just proposed has. Future ones might be a bit different.
Okay, so my main question is how this fits in with something like conceptual metaphor theory, because it seemed to me that you could say, okay, there's like, in order to come up with any concept that's abstract, you kind of have to put together smaller units, and these smaller units ultimately come from the perception, the ability to perceive things, like how you experience your own body, basically, and immediate environment. And it seemed to me that you could say, yeah, there's probably you could probably delineate a universal set of concepts that everyone kind of experiences directly, like the sort of things that you would tend to make the foundation, the target sphere, the sources for your conceptual metaphors. And then, because humans, especially prehistorically, couldn't exactly live lifestyles that are that radically different from each other, right? General hunter-gatherer, that sort of thing. You could probably find some universal concepts. But I guess my question is, like, in that sense, like, how does this fit into that, right? The written language you're proposing, how could the characters correspond to something like that, unless you're not operating off of the theoretical presuppositions of, like, cognitive linguistics, for instance?
No, that's a great question. That's a fantastic question. And yes, I am operating under the theoretical presuppositions of cognitive linguistics. I'm glad you brought up conceptual metaphor theory. I think that Lakoff, was it Lakoff who proposed prototype theory? I think it was Lakoff. because prototype theory was very much, and visualizations of prototype theory with prototypes of different types of birds from one of those texts that I can't recall now, was instrumental also in the design of this as well. So prototype theory, the idea of embodied cognition and sense percepts as actually being able to construct abstract concepts from concretes, all of that was part of the process that I went through to reach this point. And then also the idea of taking a phonosemantic approach also implicitly came from some of the linguistic wars and Lakoff's response to Chomsky, because I don't believe that we need to have a distinction between deep structure and surface structure at the level of generative grammar. Sorry, this is getting very technical, but it's underneath that. I think it's at the level of formal semantics, like Lakoff does. I think there only need to be two layers, a level of sound and a level of meaning. And so that's another reason why I took a phonosemantic approach. So yes, all of that was in there in the creative process I went through to reach this idea. The big innovation was I was trying to struggle with those same theoretical issues you were discussing. And then suddenly I had this insight when I was looking at the Indus Valley script that what if I made a writing system? And that was how I got here, basically, very swiftly.
Thank you very much, Andy.
If I can make one quick, I think because I know Professor Streeter put a question in the comment section, and I feel like it actually captures a lot of where I was trying to go with my question in terms of still not fully understanding how one gets from there to the solution you propose. I feel like if you just make sure you answer his question, it would satisfy my curiosity. If I can make a small request.
Do you mind answering Professor Streeter's question?
Well, that's a really great question. So
can you read it?
So I will read it. Okay, so if you could reiterate the part about Platonic Orientalism and how Oriental languages and hieroglyphs are misunderstood, idealized as some sort of mystical language.
That's not Tom. So Professor Streeter's my
Oh, sorry. Oh, I can't.
I generally teach writing, especially to graduate students, that clarity or simplicity is not in relation to the truth or to logic, but to an audience. There's no communication outside of context and power relations. Are you proposing changing the relationship, or are you playing around on its edges in relation to a particular audience at a time and place, to be clear?
That is a really, really good question. I think the way in which this potentially changes the power relationships is by trying to find a common symbol set that doesn't belong to any particular culture, and trying to create a set of images that can reach a global world that is not predicated on any one group exerting material or imperialist control over any other group. And so to the extent that it is possible to discover symbols that could be held in common, to the extent that that is possible, which is something that I'm, as I've said, I'm still wrestling with, that's the goal of changing the power relations, is to say, can we create a language which implies an international system that is not built on the imperial reign of one language over others? That is what I'm searching for in terms of changing power relations.
We've read the next question online, then we'll go to Daniel, then Melissa. So Bassam, I guess, has a question. If you could please elaborate or reiterate the part about Platonic Orientalism and how Oriental languages and hieroglyphics were misunderstood and or idealized as some sort of mystical language. Was that born from a misunderstanding of how Oriental alphabets are structured?
Yeah, well, I think there were a number of things. Part of it is that your average Greek was very chauvinistic. But then the second thing is, maybe your educated Greeks were not. And then the second thing is that Eric Iverson actually argues that the Egyptian priests themselves wanted the Greeks to think that their hieroglyphs were impenetrable and mystical, because they had lost so much power, where before the temples were the center of the spiritual economy of the country. Suddenly they were demoted to being like really second-rate institutions and being exploited. So there was a real attempt to try to keep outsiders from learning. And so he said, no, you can't come here. And then the second thing is that Egyptian hieroglyphs are an odd duck, because what happens with cuneiform and Chinese writing is they start off as pictures and then they get standardized into more and more abstract concepts, like alphabets. And Egyptian writing, the same thing happened, but they created multiple alphabets. So they had hieratic, and then they had demotic, and then finally, when in Greek colonization, they created the Coptic alphabet. So there were 3 or 4 different alphabets you had to learn in order to actually be proficient in the language. And this also confused outsiders. So I think there's definitely an effort of a colonized culture to also sometimes even deliberately mystifying itself to be like, don't come in here, get away, go away, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Daniel.
Yeah, it's two quick questions. One of them is maybe a bit of a softball. I know that you're not dead set on using emojis, how like the practical usability. What happens when they introduce new ones? Because it happens like once every year. Is that my understanding?
Yeah.
So how will that configure in once you give out like 5 to 10 new characters?
Well, I mean, I actually only made a selection from the, I don't know,
Okay.
600 or so emoji. I made a selection of about 120 or so. And even from the dictionary of universal concepts I used, I made a selection. I tried to avoid adjectives because adjectives are just really hard to represent with pictures because they're very vague. So I said, I only want nouns and verbs. And then I went to Emojipedia. So as long as they don't take emojis away, this kind of approach will be fine. But then there were other things that I wish there were emojis for. Like there were lots of things that there weren't emojis for that I was like, wow, there isn't an emoji for, I don't know, like animal skin. Okay, well, that says something about the kinds of people who are making emoji. They don't have to, whereas in the Dictionary of Universal Concepts, lots of languages that have a word for animal hide, because this is the way people live. But, the tech workers who are making these decisions don't look that way. So I was wishing, why don't we have an emoji for that? So that's one thing. But then the process of applying to create an emoji is very long, and you have to show there's real interest. Going to the Unicode consortium and saying, please, can you add in an animal hide for my Dictionary of Universal Concepts? Isn't necessarily, they'll be like, oh, cool project. And then, no, so.
And then my quick follow-up, I guess, and I think it's less the case now, but I remember when emojis were first rolled out, if you had an Android device, your emojis were visualized slightly differently.
Yeah.
And I wonder to the degree in which there's something to that, I guess it'd be like, for lack of a better word, almost like different fonts representing emojis. Maybe it's not the proper use of that term, but how much that kind of impacts, you think, their comprehension, or could impact their comprehension?
Yeah.
Whether you intentionally subvert the universal fonts for your own, or if that will happen across devices anyways.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that one of the things that makes emojis weird is that they don't actually use the word font. And I don't know why, because they call them skins for some reason, but they're exactly analogous to a font. But I think it's because the platforms that create the skins have proprietary control, and it rolls out across all devices that are on that platform. So ideally, I would like to create something that would be standardized as a script rather than as emoji. Ideally, if I already had a set of universal concepts and I was really, really confident in them, I would like to go to the Unicode consortium and say, let's make this a new script. It would be a new script like Cyrillic or something like that, rather than a set of emoji. People then could take that and make a font that could operate over it. I could take English writing and make like a WebDings font over it that makes it look like snowflakes. But then the underlying representation would be just those images. So that's ideally what I would like to do. But
Thank you, Daniel. And Melissa, thank you.
So, okay, so I just want to make sure I understand. Did these have sound?
yeah,
Can you read this out loud? What
Yeah.
does it sound like?
it sounds exactly like the English text
It
at the
sounds
top.
exactly like the English.
So they're all three are three versions of the same text. There's the preamble to the UN Declaration of Human Rights in English. Then there's the UN Declaration of Human Rights in IPA. And then there's the UN Declaration of Human Rights in emoji.
And so if you read.
Yeah, you can. I wish I
It's
could
the
show this to
sound
people
is
online
going
too.
to be like one-to-one.
Yeah, it's a one-to-one relationship between the emoji and the IPA alphabet in the second block of text. So if you go down character by character in the second block of text, you can see how they relate. And if you're wondering about how to pronounce something, you can always look back up at the English text. So I deliberately structured it kind of like the way the Rosetta Stone was structured. So you can go through and kind of like look through and see different relations between the text.
Well, I had a different question.
Yeah.
That's more interesting.
Okay,
What were you gonna say though?
no, nothing. I mean, it's yeah, hard to read. Yeah.
What's your more intriguing question?
Well, no, I mean, I just wanted to make sure I understood the relationship of sound to the emoji. So, but no, the more interesting question I think is, in your research, like, what do you think is the drive to create a universal language, and does it match up with your own? I mean, can you say that there tends to be a drive,
Yeah,
like among these people
Yeah.
that have created universal
There
languages?
is.
And is it similar to your?
So I think that it depends on the cultural context. Before the scientific revolution, people tend to be looking for the primal language, the true language that gives you almost a magical control over reality. After the scientific revolution, it becomes tied to ideals of enlightenment, to ideals of the creation of world empire, and to the creation of standards that can coordinate for science across all disciplines and domains. I view my drive as being slightly different in that I view what I'm doing as more about not necessarily advancing a specific ideological project, but about finding a way to facilitate an intercultural dialogue that can actually transcend the limitations of current political norms. And so whether images can actually do that, whether you could find a set of images that could do that, that's ultimately what I'm searching for, is something where no one captures the flag. Whereas I think the people who are interested in enlightenment have this idea that there is a rationalist science that is knowable, and that certain people are the keepers and stewards of that rationalist science. And if we just create an abstract language where everything's pinned down and we have everything categorized, everything will just magically, everyone will, fall. I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that there will ever be a universal theory of everything. So I think I have slightly different aims, although there definitely is a relationship, to be sure. Yeah.
So in your dissertation, you do not anticipate having a universal theory of everything.
Yeah, too bad,
Yeah.
I could have, but yeah.
Okay, well, it's good to have some parameters.
Yeah.
I think you listened to the question. Any other questions in person?
Mackenzie, did you have a question?
The more I think about it, the less it seems related to your projects.
Okay.
And do you have anyone online? Okay, thank you. So perhaps we can thank John or Zach again. Thanks also to the faculty of Information and Media Studies. I almost said that wrong. I want to say that wrong. And thank you to Dean Henderson for her support. Thanks to Matt for making the hybrid meeting possible, boldly entering into the future. Thanks to Avery, who's part of the mediations committee, for great posters, which I spam throughout the building on Thursday night and Friday mornings. Next week, so intriguingly, I have in front of me a sheet of paper reminding me that I am presenting next week. So I'm going to take off my moderator's hat and put on my presenter's hat, title my talks, just so I don't forget, Understanding Genre Through Journeying. I'm looking at fictional genres of literature. And thanks also to Broadcast, the radio show / podcast on Radio Western, which is broadcast on the radio station Tuesday and Thursday morning, 11:30. They showcase graduate student research, and they've also been putting in plugs for us. So I'll reciprocate and put in a plug for them. So thank you, everyone. On your way out, be sure to help yourself to some snack, just so I don't eat them all when you all leave the room. And looking forward to next week. Same bat time, same bat place, 4:30 next week. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.